George Floyd, known as Floyd or Big Floyd by friends and family, was in Minneapolis on business, far from his family and community, when 4 Minneapolis police officers murdered him in broad daylight. It was, in effect, a modern-day lynching, as those police officers served as judge, jury, and executioner on an unarmed, nonviolent, handcuffed black man. He was dragged from his car, pinned to the ground, and choked, even as he begged for air, by officers using unnecessary and deadly force. Video of the incident clearly shows the officer, Derek Chauvin, employing a deadly chokehold as Floyd repeatedly states, "I can't breathe." He was nonviolent, unarmed, and begging for mercy in broad daylight. Yet both officers present at the scene continued to use illegal force until it was too late. Though 4 Minneapolis officers involved in George's murder have since been fired, and Derek Chauvin has now been arrested and charged with Floyd's murder, his family has yet to receive complete justice for the tragic loss they now face. The remaining officers responsible for this horrible killing must be tried and charged with the murder of George Floyd. This is from justiceforbigfloyd.com, one of the websites that I have in the description of this video. I found this website through Emily Pekka, who is the artist who painted the portrait that you saw in the thumbnail that you clicked on in memory of George Floyd. George Floyd was a human being. He was an unarmed black man, a truck driver, a rapper, a father, a friend, someone who was an American citizen with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These rights which were taken away from him in front of all of our eyes by officers of our own government, culminating with having a knee against his neck for 8 minutes and 43 seconds. And regardless of semantics and political persuasions, something on which we should all be able to agree is that George Floyd deserves justice. Now, this is where we need to begin a conversation about justice. There's been a great deal of anger, which is understandable. I myself felt angry when I started to read the facts of the case, when I started to see what had happened here. But at this point, what I want to do now is talk about justice. How do we get justice for George Floyd? And starting off, what is justice? And justice is an idea. It's an idea that we have about the way things should be. Now, justice does not exist in a state of nature. In a state of nature, the strong oppress the weak. What you saw in that gruesome video is something that you see in nature all the time. And because of that, this is why we get together and we form a civil society. We form a government through the social contract. And the social contract says, look, we are forming a government so that we can protect our lives, our liberties, our property. We give a certain amount of these things over to this government in return for protections of our freedom and our safety. And we also create mechanisms for punishing injustice. And so justice is going to be served by bringing anyone responsible for George Floyd's death, directly or as an accomplice, charging them, bringing them to trial, and letting them have their day in court to avenge what we all saw as a great injustice and a mockery of human dignity. Now, where are we going to look when we're looking for principles of human dignity? I would start with the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which reads, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. George Floyd was an American citizen who was entitled by right to the privileges and immunities of citizenship, which the privileges of citizenship are easy to see. The right to free speech, the right to a fair trial and due process, things that George Floyd never received. He called out for his life. He called out for air, did not receive these things, and instead he received a very humiliating death. And we think about the immunities of citizenship, the things that no citizen should ever be subjected to. Having a knee placed into your neck. And this is something that after conversing with a law enforcement officers are trained not to do this. Even if there was initial resistance, law enforcement officers are trained to de-escalate. And when we see someone begging for air, someone who goes unconscious, law enforcement officers are trained to do their mission to protect people. And that failed in this case. Now, having a knee in your neck reminds me of a passage from the Bible, from the book of Joshua, that after Joshua finished his battle with the 5 Amorite kings, this is the story in the Bible where Joshua asked God to make the sun stand still so that he could finish destroying his enemies. And then he goes to these kings and he puts his foot on their necks as a gesture of humiliation before he kills them. Now, the ancient Israelites were responsible for giving the world 3 of the most noteworthy Western religions, but they did not give us our system of justice. Our system of justice comes from the Romans, and when I think about the Romans, I think about the ancient philosopher and orator Cicero, who delivered orations against Varus. Now, Varus was a Roman official who was a governor in Sicily. And everybody knew that Varus was corrupt. Everybody knew that Varus had committed crimes, broken laws, but those were over in Sicily. The Romans at the time did not think of the people of Sicily as citizens. They thought a regional governor is going to steal things. A regional governor is going to get rich. But then Cicero found something. Cicero discovered that Varus had crucified a Roman citizen. And Cicero began to write down this account of a Roman citizen on a cross yelling, "I am a Roman citizen. I am a Roman citizen. I can't breathe. I can't breathe." And this is where we see that the idea of citizenship is that you are immune to cruel treatment by officers of your own government. It was that bit of information that persuaded the Roman jury to convict Varus, because Varus, as an officer of the government, had violated the privileges and immunities of a Roman citizen. And in this case, the social contract has been violated by the killing of an unarmed black man, a citizen of the United States who was reduced to begging for air before he lost consciousness. And not even in the event of the loss of consciousness was there any compassion for this man by those who had sworn an oath to serve and protect him. And so we, as George Floyd's fellow citizens, have an obligation to pursue justice for George Floyd and to make sure that the actions that we take on his behalf are taken in the pursuit of justice. And the next thing that I think about is Socrates, after he had been condemned to die. This comes from the dialogue with Crito. Crito was a rich friend of Socrates, and after Socrates had been condemned to death for basically being annoying and officially corrupting the youth and denying the gods of the state, Crito comes in one morning and Socrates wakes up and is like, what are you doing here? Crito says, hey, I've paid off the guards. Let's get out of here. Okay, I've bailed you out. Basically, we all know that your imprisonment is unjust. And if you come with me, that will avenge that injustice. And Socrates says, wait a minute, Crito. Let's talk about justice. And let's decide if me leaving this prison is going to do something to create justice. And Socrates concluded that we ought not to retaliate or render evil for evil to anyone, whatever evil we may have suffered from them. And this is an approach that most people who have sought justice for George Floyd have taken. We have seen peaceful protests across the nation that have really been moving, where you see at times the police officers who were there kneeling with the protesters, and you see this solidarity of decent human beings everywhere who want justice for George Floyd. Now, some have resorted to violence, vandalism, destruction of property. Others have defended them, have defended those who are choosing violence in the pursuit of justice. And what I want to ask here, does violence create justice? Now, this is where I've got a video comparing Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. And I want to discuss that a bit here because I find it very relevant. Now, Martin Luther King said that violence does not lead to justice. And he said here in The Other America, which he delivered at Stanford University in 1967, 1 year before his death. Now, this is something that has been taken out of context by both sides. I'm going to try to give this to you with a bit of context because it's definitely nuanced. Let me say, as I've always said, and will continue to say, that riots are socially destructive and self-defeating. But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. As long as America postpones justice, we stand in the position of having these recurrences of violence and riots over and over again. Now, Dr. King says here, when he says that riots are the language of the unheard, that it's something that's going to be around as long as we do not, as a society, pursue justice. At no point does he defend rioting, which we've seen in some videos that have been circulating on the internet. It gives the viewer the impression that he was condoning rioting. But he says here that riots are socially destructive and self-defeating. Now, they are expressions of anger that people have, but they do not lead to justice. Now, Malcolm X has a bit of a different perspective, but we don't want to oversimplify this, okay? You don't want to fall in the trap of thinking, okay, Martin Luther King, nonviolence, Malcolm X, violence, because Malcolm X was a philosopher. He had a system to determine when is violence going to be used. And what Malcolm X always preached was that self-defense was a legitimate act of justice. And you can see the famous photo of Malcolm X at his window with a high-powered rifle, and he's looking out the window, and he is looking for people who are going to try to harm his family. That he says that with that photo, that he is going to protect what is his. He is going to protect his family from acts of violence. Malcolm X's most famous speech is the ballot or the bullet. Now, the thing is here that there is an obvious preference that he has for the ballot to operate within the social contract, okay? So when we make the social contract, we say that this is the way that we're going to do things, and we are all going to make that agreement, and when somebody does not do things according to the social contract, we have a justice system to punish them. Now, when Malcolm X delivered the ballot or the bullet, he said, I believe in action on all fronts by whatever means necessary. Now, we've got to be very careful in interpreting this passage because in order for the violence to be justified, the violence has to be necessary. So let's read a passage from the ballot or the bullet. Now, who is it that opposes you in carrying out the law? The police department itself, with police dogs and clubs, whenever you demonstrate against segregation, whether it is segregated education, segregated housing, or anything else, the law is on your side, and anyone who stands in the way is not the law any longer. They are breaking the law. They are not representatives of the law. Anytime you demonstrate against segregation and a man has the audacity to put a police dog on you, kill that dog. Kill him, I'm telling you. Kill that dog. I say it, if they put me in jail tomorrow, kill that dog. Then you'll put a stop to it. So you see that Malcolm X is saying that if you are attacked, if violence is used against you, then you will use violence in return. If somebody would have pulled Derek Chauvin off of George Floyd by force, if someone had intervened, then that act of violence would have been an act of justice, according to Malcolm X. But given that that was not the case, going and looting a Target or taking the arm off of a statue of Louis XVI or burning down the building headquarters of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, people who were not responsible for this death, this does not meet that test of self-defense. So we need to be very careful before we use Malcolm X in defense of violence. Now, Ossie Davis, who delivered a eulogy of Malcolm X, which you can find at the end of the autobiography of Malcolm X, I think that it is worthwhile to quote this at length, because here's somebody who knew Malcolm X and he wanted to speak for Malcolm X's legacy. There are those who will consider it their duty to tell us to revile him, to flee, even from the presence of his memory, to save ourselves by writing him out of the history of our turbulent times. Many will ask what Harlem finds to honor in this stormy, controversial, and bold young captain. And we will smile. Many will say, turn away from this man, for he is not a man but a demon, a monster, a subverter and an enemy of the black man. And we will smile. They will say that he is of hate, a fanatic, a racist, who can only bring evil to the cause for which you struggle. And we will answer and say to them, did you ever talk to Brother Malcolm? Did you ever touch him or have him smile at you? Did you ever really listen to him? Did he ever do a mean thing? Was he ever himself associated with violence or any public disturbance? For if you did, you would know him. And if you knew him, you would know why we must honor him. And you think about the photos that you've seen of Malcolm X smiling. You know, this is somebody that people have tried to characterize as someone other than who he was. That this is a man who could really light you up when he smiled at you. This was a man who was a man of love, who then was caricatured as a man of hate by people who didn't want to listen to him, even though what he was saying was no different than what we honor from our forefathers at Lexington and Concord when the British came in order to take the weapons of the Minutemen, in order to disarm them and put them in a state of vassalage. They chose to fire back and protect what was theirs. That would be an act of justice. Now, when Malcolm X, again, when he says, by any means necessary, you could think in terms of, has the violence that we've seen so far been necessary? Derek Chauvin wasn't arrested for 4 days. Now, that disturbed me. I'll say that as an observer, that disturbed me. My first response, just like anybody else, was to look at that video and like, oh my goodness, that is messed up. Why has that guy not been arrested? At the same time, after talking to an attorney and a law enforcement officer, I learned that 4 days really isn't a very long time for the state to build a case against someone because they've got to get it right. Now, we've got to ask ourselves, do we want to live in a society where there's a troubling video and somebody says, all right, let's go arrest that person right now without any kind of due process? So given that the violence, the looting, the arson started as a protest against the lack of an arrest warrant, people were working on that arrest warrant. He wasn't a flight risk. He wasn't a risk to hurt anybody else. So the state had a few days to build a case. Now, I also want to note that there's a very credible argument for if there'd been no demonstrations at all, like there'd been no peaceful protests, there'd been no video, it's entirely possible that Derek Chauvin would have never been arrested. Perhaps fired, but not arrested for a crime. And so there definitely is room for peaceful protest within the social contract, and that's why that's protected by the First Amendment to our Constitution, which unfortunately we've seen many governments imposing curfews on people that are keeping peaceful protesters from being able to hold candlelight vigils. And that is something that I think is wrong, because they need to arrest the people who are responsible for the crimes while allowing Americans their First Amendment rights. Now, I've invoked the Minutemen at Lexington and Concord, but I think that we also need to take a look at the Boston Tea Party, because the thing is that people have had some very legitimate questions on Twitter where they're asking, okay, if you have a problem with the looting and the violence, then what do you think about the Boston Tea Party when the Sons of Liberty got onto a boat belonging to the British East India Company and dumped tons of tea into the harbor? I don't know about the weight, but a lot of tea, okay, which was property, which belonged to someone. And we can't look at that uncritically, all right? We can't say that we're going to refuse to look at this critically, because when you think about the Boston Tea Party, was the Boston Tea Party an act of justice or an act of anger? Did it create justice? Did it lead to justice? Now, we could say on one hand it led to our revolution, but on the other hand, the Boston Tea Party was an act of vandalism and property damage that came after the Tea Act, which was an act of injustice because it made the colonists buy tea belonging to the British East India Company. So it was a violation of the economic freedom of the colonists. And the colonists then, or at least the Sons of Liberty, who some people would say they're just a vocal minority, they didn't represent the colonists as a whole, but the Sons of Liberty get on this ship and they damage property, and the British government then responded with the Intolerable Acts. And the Intolerable Acts, which closed the port of Boston, placed Massachusetts under martial law, brought more troops over there to enforce this state of martial law, to enforce this state of unfreedom, then we see it spiral out of control. And we need to remember that there were colonists who wanted to try to find some accommodation with Great Britain until the summer of 1776, even when the war had been going on for 15 months. Now, we can say on one side that revolutionary violence resulted in the overthrow of an unjust government, but we also don't know what would have happened if the Boston Tea Party had never happened. Okay, so we don't really have a way of knowing if we might have seen reconciliation if they had resorted to reason. So, while you can argue that this led us to becoming an independent country, a lot of lives were lost. A lot of property was confiscated. One thing that we don't like to talk about is all of the property that was confiscated from loyalists that was never given back to them. Our revolution is something that we can be largely proud of, but we shouldn't look at it uncritically to say that it did nothing but bring about justice. Another example of what I would say someone who had good intentions but did not bring about justice would be John Brown at the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. Now, John Brown and his sons were abolitionists living in the Kansas Territory, and they heard about the sack of Lawrence, the burning down of Lawrence, Kansas by pro-slavery settlers, and they decided that they were going to retaliate for this, that they were going to retaliate, but not against the people who were directly responsible for the sack of Lawrence, but against people who were not responsible, against a random family of pro-slavery settlers, that they went to their house and told all of the men to come out and proceeded to execute them with broadswords. And this is something that, while one can say that John Brown was looking for justice, was justice served in finding these people who were not responsible for what happened and killing them and making them pay for with their lives for something that someone else had done. It would be very difficult to make that argument. And we want to note here that most Americans have chosen nonviolence. What we've seen in Richmond, for example. I'll let the mayor of Richmond speak here, LeVar Stoney, the mayor of Richmond. At this point, bad actors are hijacking the cause. They're taking advantage of our pain, making a mockery of George Floyd's death, and using our frustration, our anger, and our heartbreak to create chaos. And that is the mayor of Richmond talking, who has seen people in his city protesting peacefully for justice for George Floyd, and has seen people coming in, possibly paid protesters, to hijack what's going on here and to deny people their right to advocate within the law for justice for George Floyd within the law. And, we've seen these protests being hijacked, but we've also seen people on social media who are endorsing violence and vandalism, either directly or indirectly. I saw a thread on Twitter where an Egyptologist was explaining to people how someone could hypothetically take down the Washington Monument, the obelisk that we see in Washington, D.C., in honor of our nation's first president. And we have to ask here, do crimes against property create justice? And we want to remind ourselves that the purpose of government under the social contract is to protect life, liberty, and property. You want your property protected, but then people say, well, property's replaceable. We just went to Target and that's replaceable. They had insurance on that. But somebody has to pay for it. Somebody's insurance premiums are going to go up. The Target employees can't work. Well, somebody said, well, they're going to pay them. Well, that money has to come from somewhere. Prices are going to have to go up for someone. Someone has to pay the price. Someone built that property, and someone's going to have to build it again. And someone just coming and destroying in a night what people have built. And I really want to shout out to all of the people who are producing art, who are producing all kinds of beautiful things in order to honor George Floyd. So what have these acts of violence and vandalism accomplished? I see curfews, fear, resentment, chaos. I see the calling of the National Guard. I see people mobilizing under the banner of law and order. But I don't see justice for George Floyd. We see now there is less attention on justice for George Floyd than there is on restoring peace and order and the rule of law, which are part of the basis for our social contract. And if you want to see evidence of the counterproductivity of this violence, of this vandalism, as Dr. King said, riots are socially destructive and self-defeating, just scroll through President Trump's Twitter and look at his engagement on these tweets calling for law and order versus the usual engagement on his tweets that, when people are rioting and vandalizing, there are calls for law and order. And if you want to think about precedents, you can look at the revolutions of 1848 in Europe or the election of 1968 in the United States. When things get out of hand, we see that more conservative politicians will mobilize the silent majority, as Nixon called it. And so the thing is, people who are committing acts of vandalism, of property damage, people who are rioting, it is at the end of the day counterproductive and does nothing to bring about justice for George Floyd. And so we ask ourselves here, is the violence in this case warranted under the social contract? When Malcolm X says that I believe in action on all fronts by whatever means necessary, when he says this, is it necessary right now? We think about, this isn't a case where Derek Chauvin has been acquitted by a jury. This is a case where he has been arrested. The other people are likely to be arrested if these peaceful protests continue. And remember that the delays that we're seeing, they can be accounted for by due process. The same due process that any of us would want if we were accused of a crime. And so as far as that goes, I'm going to close off with the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shewn that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. Not everyone is going to see the same path to justice for George Floyd. I know that as well as anyone. But no matter what path you choose that path based on philosophy and reason rather than emotion. Think about, what is this going to do? Is this going to further justice? And also ask yourself, do you truly believe that we don't have a system under our current social contract to give justice to George Floyd and his family? I would like to believe that we do. I mean, it's just part of my job as a teacher is to believe in this country. And I want to see what happens, and I also want to continue to support all of the peaceful protests that are happening. Find one anywhere around, advocate for an end to these curfews, which are designed to inhibit peaceful protest. And also, I've got a few links, the link I mentioned earlier, and then a legitimate link that I found through USA Today where you can donate to George Floyd's family. I donated last night. I typically would not ask for someone to donate to a cause that I have not donated to already. And again, thank you very much to Emily Pekka for the beautiful portrait of George Floyd and for allowing me to repost this on my video that is intended to honor his life. Rest in peace, George Floyd.
Say, watch me lay low, never coming high. I'm a real G, stay high till I die. D-I-E, it's F-O-L-O-R-D. Watch me raise up in my drop top C.